It started with a whisper, a murmur in the corridors of ITV that quickly grew into a storm no one could ignore. What happens when a once-beloved television personality, adored by millions, suddenly finds herself abandoned by the very network that built her comeback? When the cameras stop rolling, when the applause dies, and when friends disappear one by one, what becomes of a woman whose entire public persona was built on charm, resilience, and, yes, a touch of royal mystique? For Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, that question has become a haunting reality, and it came faster than anyone could have predicted. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, Sarah Ferguson, affectionately known as Fergie, was ITV's secret weapon. Charming, witty, approachable, and surprisingly relatable for someone who once lived in the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace, she had a way of drawing viewers in. Audiences watched as she navigated life after her royal divorce with grace, humor, and, at times, scandalous candor. ITV executives touted her as a savior of daytime television, a personality who could lift ratings simply by walking onto a set. And for a time, that promise seemed endless. She was unstoppable. She was invincible, or at least, that's what everyone believed. But beneath the polished smile, beneath the laughter and light-hearted interviews, a storm was brewing. A storm that had nothing to do with ratings and everything to do with shadows from the past. Shadows connected to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, and the controversies that had followed him for more than a decade. The Epstein scandal, the whispers that never quite died down, the payments, the photographs, the meetings that some wanted to forget, but others never could. For Sarah Ferguson, these shadows were no longer just headlines. They were an approaching tide, one that would threaten everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. Imagine sitting in a studio, lights beaming down, cameras rolling, the audience captivated, only to receive a call that could shatter your life. That's exactly what Sarah reportedly experienced in the weeks leading up to her sudden axing. ITV executives, once her staunchest supporters, now saw only risk. Risk to the network's reputation, risk to advertisers, risk to the carefully curated image they had spent years protecting. And in a world where public perception is everything, that kind of risk is often unforgivable. But let's pause for a moment. What exactly triggered this seismic shift? After all, Sarah had been through scandals before. She had faced public scrutiny, tabloid attacks, and even financial troubles. She had weathered storms that would have crushed lesser personalities. Why now? Why would ITV, a network that had embraced her post-divorce charisma, suddenly pull the plug, leaving her career dangling by a thread? The answer lies in a combination of timing, renewed media scrutiny, and the unrelenting shadow of Prince Andrew's controversies. For years, Sarah's association with her ex-husband had been a footnote, a minor irritation for a public more interested in fairy tale divorces and personal redemption arcs. But when new investigations reignited public interest in Andrew's ties to Epstein, those footnotes became headlines. And headlines, as any public figure knows, have consequences. For ITV, the calculus was clear. Continue to feature Sarah and risk the network being linked, even indirectly, to a scandal that had captured global attention, or cut ties quietly and preserve the brand. Reports suggest that the decision was anything but easy. Internal meetings reportedly stretched for hours, with executives debating every possible scenario. Should they issue a statement? Should they offer her a dignified exit? Or should they make a swift, quiet decision and hope the media would interpret it as nothing more than routine programming changes? The final choice, as we now know, was the latter. Sarah Ferguson was axed, and the announcement, while officially framed as a scheduling decision, carried a weight far heavier than the words on a press release. But the story doesn't end with a simple network decision. For Sarah, the implications are far-reaching. Friends and collaborators have reportedly begun to distance themselves, some quietly, others publicly. Charities that once welcomed her as a figurehead have pulled back, wary of being associated with controversy. Publishers have reconsidered book deals. Even the social appearances that once guaranteed headlines are now fraught with risk. It's as though an invisible hand has rewritten the script of her life, leaving her isolated in a world where image is currency and connections are everything. And yet, Sarah Ferguson is not one to disappear quietly. Sources close to her suggest that she is fighting back in subtle, strategic ways, seeking to control the narrative before it spirals further. But controlling the narrative in the age of social media, 24-hour news cycles, and relentless tabloids is no small feat. Every statement, every photograph, every public appearance is scrutinized, dissected, and often distorted. For someone whose life has been lived in the public eye for decades, this is a new and formidable challenge. So what does this mean for ITV? For their daytime schedule, for their advertisers, for the viewers who have grown to love Sarah Ferguson's presence? Networks are businesses, yes, but they are also storytellers. They sell narratives as much as they sell content. And when one of their most beloved storytellers becomes a potential liability, they are forced to make choices that can seem cruel, even if they are calculated. In axing Sarah, ITV may have preserved its brand in the short term, but at what cost to the story it once celebrated? A story of redemption, resilience, and second chances? Now, consider the broader context. This is not just a television story. This is a story about the modern intersection of celebrity, royalty, scandal, and media. It is about how quickly fortunes can shift, how alliances can crumble, and how public perception can turn from admiration to suspicion in a matter of days. And in Sarah Ferguson's case, it is about the terrifying speed with which a carefully managed comeback can unravel when the past refuses to stay buried. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of all is the uncertainty. Sarah's career, her public image, her personal brand, all of it hangs in the balance. Will she recover, reinvent herself again, and find a new platform to share her charm and storytelling with the world? Or has this been the beginning of a permanent exile from the television stage that once loved her so fiercely? And more importantly, what does she know that the public does not? Are there stories, connections, or secrets yet to be revealed that could change everything again? As we explore the next chapters, we will peel back the layers of this unfolding drama. We will examine the decisions made behind closed doors at ITV. We will look at the influence of royal connections, the shadow of scandal, and the chilling effect of association in the court of public opinion. We will reveal how one of Britain's most recognized and beloved women is navigating a crisis that threatens not just her career, but her legacy. And as we do, we will ask the questions you are thinking. What really happened behind those studio doors? Who benefited from her downfall? And most importantly, what comes next for Sarah Ferguson? Because one thing is certain, the story is far from over. The cameras may have stopped rolling, the contract may have been terminated, and the headlines may have shifted, but the undercurrents, the whispered conversations, the leaked emails, the hidden agendas, are still at play. And for Sarah Ferguson, the next move could change everything. Will she rise from the ashes once more? Or is this the moment where the curtain finally falls? She was born into a world of expectation, charm, and privilege, but no one could have predicted the whirlwind her life would become. Sarah Ferguson's story is not one of quiet luxury. It is a tale of dramatic highs and devastating lows, of public adoration followed by scathing criticism, and of a woman who has constantly had to reinvent herself in the glare of relentless scrutiny. Before the scandals, before the axing from ITV, before the whispers and the leaked emails, there was the rise of the Duchess who dared to defy convention and capture the hearts of the nation. Imagine a young woman stepping into the limelight, not with entitlement, but with curiosity, warmth, and an undeniable charisma. Sarah Ferguson, known to friends as Fergie, possessed a magnetic personality that drew people in immediately. She was approachable, lively, and, at times, refreshingly candid for someone navigating the rarefied air of British aristocracy. From the very beginning, she exuded a mixture of charm and mischief that made her relatable yet intriguing, qualities that would later define her public persona. Her early life, while comfortable, was not devoid of struggle. There were lessons learned, mistakes made, and ambitions nurtured quietly behind the polished exterior of a young woman destined for headlines. Her entrance into the royal family catapulted her into a spotlight she could never have fully anticipated. Married to Prince Andrew in the extravagant summer of 1986, Sarah quickly became a favorite of the press, admired for her vivacity and willingness to embrace royal duties with a touch of individuality. Unlike the traditional, poised image expected of royals. Sarah's playful nature and human quirks made her instantly relatable. She was not just a princess. She was someone who laughed, stumbled, and lived in a way that felt tangible to the public. And the public loved her for it. Her charm was infectious. Her presence on the red carpet, in charitable events, and in royal photo ops often stole the show. She was, for a time, the perfect balance between tradition and modernity, royalty and relatability. Yet, the very traits that made her endearing would later become lightning rods for criticism. Her warmth and openness, her willingness to appear imperfect, were double-edged swords. The tabloids, which had once celebrated her, could just as quickly turn on her. Her human moments were dissected, exaggerated, and turned into fodder for sensational headlines. And when personal missteps occurred, financial troubles, marital strains, public gaffes, they became magnified under the unrelenting gaze of the media. It was a harsh education in the perils of fame, one that would shape the way she navigated her post-royal life for decades to come. The divorce from Prince Andrew, finalized in 1996, could have been the end of her public relevance. Many in her position might have faded into obscurity, retreating from the media frenzy that had once celebrated them. But Sarah Ferguson refused to vanish quietly. She understood something crucial about the world she now inhabited. That reinvention was not optional. It was survival. She embarked on a journey to redefine herself, transitioning from the Duchess of York to a media personality, author, and advocate with a carefully crafted mix of charm, honesty, and professional acumen. She began writing books for children, sharing her stories with a generation eager for guidance from someone who had lived a life of extraordinary experiences. Her writing was imbued with imagination, kindness, and a desire to inspire. She wasn't just a former royal. She was a storyteller, a creator, and someone striving to leave a positive mark on the world. At the same time, Sarah re-entered the media landscape, gradually regaining the public's trust and admiration. She appeared on television, in interviews, and on daytime talk shows, always bringing her signature mix of warmth and vulnerability. Audiences responded. They were fascinated not only by her royal history but by her resilience, her ability to face setbacks with dignity, and her willingness to be candid about her mistakes. Sarah became a symbol of reinvention, proof that even those who stumble publicly can rise again, provided they are willing to embrace change and confrontation with their own narrative. ITV, recognizing her magnetic appeal and unique perspective, welcomed her back, offering a platform that blended nostalgia, charisma, and storytelling in a way few personalities could replicate. Yet, as with any comeback story, there were undercurrents of tension, moments of fragility hidden beneath the smile. The media's fascination with her past, her connection to Prince Andrew, financial missteps, and occasional lapses in judgment, remained a persistent shadow. Sarah's rise was never free from scrutiny. Every appearance, every book launch, every public event carried the weight of past controversies. And while her audience often admired her candor, the scrutiny never fully vanished. There was always a fine line between fascination and judgment, between adoration and condemnation, and Sarah walked that line with remarkable poise, until recently, when the past she thought she had outgrown began to encroach upon her carefully rebuilt life. The story of her rise is also a story of courage and adaptability. Sarah Ferguson's ability to navigate the complex intersection of royalty, media, and personal reinvention demonstrates an uncommon resilience. Few could withstand the level of public examination she endured and still return to the spotlight with both grace and agency. She learned the hard way that visibility is both power and vulnerability, that public affection is fleeting, and that in a world obsessed with scandal, the narrative can turn against you with little warning. Yet, she pressed on, using her voice, her writing, and her television appearances to craft a persona that was human, accessible, and, at times, inspirational. She was no longer just a duchess. She was a personality, a storyteller, and a woman learning to own her narrative despite the complexities of her history. But here is where the story begins to twist. The same public fascination that fueled her rise also created the conditions for her sudden fall. ITV's embrace of Sarah Ferguson was not merely about entertainment. It was about brand, ratings, and perception. The network's faith in her was tied to her ability to maintain an image of charm and relatability while sidestepping controversies that could taint their daytime programming. And while Sarah had largely succeeded in this balancing act for years, the renewed scrutiny surrounding her ex-husband's ongoing scandals created a situation that no charisma could fully mitigate. What had once been a supportive audience and a protective network began to shift. The walls that once shielded her from the full force of public judgment were beginning to crumble. Even as Sarah continued to engage with her projects, write her books, and make public appearances, insiders suggest she felt the weight of scrutiny intensifying. Calls were reportedly more guarded, contracts were reviewed more rigorously, and the network's decisions began to hint at a desire to distance themselves before a storm could hit. Sarah's rise had been meteoric, yes, but in the world of public perception, meteors are fleeting. The higher you rise, the harder the fall, and the network, perhaps, had calculated that the risk of association with ongoing controversies was no longer worth the reward. It's a stark reminder that reinvention, no matter how skillfully executed, is always vulnerable to external forces beyond one's control. And yet, Sarah Ferguson's rise was never solely about personal ambition or media strategy. It was about connection. Connecting with audiences, connecting with causes, connecting with a public eager to see someone human navigate extraordinary circumstances. Her work as an author, her appearances on talk shows, and her involvement with charities all reinforced a narrative of resilience, empathy, and relatability. She became a figure who, despite royal lineage, could be understood and admired by ordinary people. It was this very ability to connect that made her indispensable to ITV and beloved by viewers, but it also made her intensely visible, leaving her open to the backlash that comes when association with scandal becomes unavoidable. And so, the rise of the fallen Duchess is a study in contrasts: visibility and vulnerability, charisma and scrutiny, affection and judgment. Sarah Ferguson's early post-divorce years were marked by careful navigation, strategic reinvention, and an uncanny ability to capture the public's imagination. She understood that her life, while extraordinary, was also a story, one that needed to be told, controlled, and presented in a way that balanced authenticity with protection. Her ascent back into public favor was not accidental. It was the product of resilience, intuition, and relentless effort to turn personal narrative into public redemption. But even the strongest ascent can be destabilized by forces beyond one's control. And in Sarah Ferguson's case, the forces that would precipitate her sudden removal from ITV were closer, darker, and far more insidious than mere media scrutiny. What she had thought of as a managed comeback, a carefully orchestrated reinvention, was about to collide with a storm that threatened not just her career, but her carefully constructed public identity. The very qualities that had endeared her to millions, her warmth, her relatability, her openness, were now under threat from the shadows of her past, from connections she could neither ignore nor fully control. And so, as we look back on her rise, it is impossible not to sense the fragility beneath the glamour, the vulnerability behind the smile. Sarah Ferguson's story reminds us that in the world of fame, public favor is fleeting, and redemption, no matter how hard-earned, can be jeopardized by the echoes of history. For every moment of triumph, there is the potential for upheaval. For every applause, the possibility of silence. And in Sarah's case, that silence would come not with a roar, but with the quiet precision of a network making a decision that would ripple through her life and the lives of those who had once stood by her. She didn't just appear on television, she transformed it. That was the whisper among ITV executives the first time Sarah Ferguson walked onto a daytime set with her signature mix of charm, warmth, and unpredictability. For a network that thrived on relatability, laughter, and emotional connection, Fergie was more than a guest. She was a phenomenon. She was magnetic, irresistible, and impossible to ignore. But how did a former Duchess, whose royal days were behind her, become ITV's golden ticket, the person they trusted to lift ratings and anchor their daytime schedule? The answer lies in a love affair as strategic as it was symbiotic, one that would shape her post-royal career for years, until everything changed. The story begins with recognition. After her divorce from Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson was, in the eyes of many, a figure in transition. She was no longer a royal in residence, but she retained all the allure of her former life. Media outlets, always eager for a narrative that combined royalty and relatability, quickly latched onto her. Her candid interviews, playful demeanor, and unpolished charm made her stand out in a landscape often dominated by rehearsed personalities and formulaic programming. ITV executives, always keen to spot talent that could captivate audiences across demographics, saw the perfect opportunity. Here was a woman who combined star power with authenticity, a rare combination that promised ratings and loyalty from viewers. And the numbers proved them right. Every time Sarah appeared on the screen, ratings spiked. Daytime viewers tuned in not just for the shows themselves, but for her presence, her insights, her humor, and her relatability. She could talk about children's books one moment and charitable initiatives the next, bridging the gap between personal anecdote and universal appeal. Her interviews often became talking points in the media, creating free publicity for ITV and reinforcing the perception that Sarah Ferguson was not just a guest star. She was a brand, a phenomenon, a personality that could carry a program on her own. ITV's investment in Sarah was both strategic and personal. They didn't just offer her spots on pre-existing shows, they built programming around her. Specials, daytime appearances, book promotions, and charity features became vehicles for her storytelling. The network positioned her as a bridge between the royal world and the everyday viewer, someone who could humanize monarchy while remaining aspirational. Executives reportedly marveled at her ability to handle live audiences, interact spontaneously with hosts, and convey authenticity without losing polish. In short, she was a professional who understood the machinery of television and the fickle nature of public affection, and she leveraged it brilliantly. Yet the partnership was not without tension. While Sarah brought undeniable charm and visibility, her unpredictability occasionally challenged network executives. She was, after all, accustomed to operating in a world where decorum and discretion were paramount, but not necessarily structured by scripts or ratings pressures. There were moments of friction, a spontaneous comment that needed smoothing over in post-production, a candid admission that risked headlines, or an unexpected emotional response that could shift the tone of a segment. But these challenges were also part of her appeal. Audiences felt her humanity, the laughter, the tears, the unfiltered emotion, and that relatability translated into loyalty. ITV tolerated the occasional hiccup because the payoff was enormous. Viewers returned, advertisers noticed, and the network's daytime identity became intertwined with Sarah Ferguson's presence. The love affair deepened as both parties recognized the mutual benefits. For Sarah, ITV provided a platform to reinvent herself, to step beyond the shadow of her royal past, and to cultivate a persona that was independent, charismatic, and commercially viable. She could speak freely, share her work as an author, and engage with audiences who were curious about her life after the palace. For ITV, she was a ratings magnet, a media darling, and a symbol of resilience and relatability, qualities that appealed to viewers in a way few other personalities could replicate. It was a classic symbiotic relationship. Each needed the other, and both thrived on the public's fascination with her story. But even as the partnership flourished, the underlying tension of her past remained a subtle but persistent factor. The network, while enthusiastic about her appeal, was also acutely aware of the vulnerabilities inherent in featuring someone with a high-profile royal history and public scrutiny. Any misstep, any resurfacing of controversy, had the potential to ripple across programming and public perception. Behind closed doors, executives reportedly monitored her appearances carefully, balancing the desire to showcase her charm with the need to protect the network's image. And Sarah, aware of her position, navigated this delicate balance with strategic finesse, until the events that would disrupt the equilibrium arrived like a storm. Audiences, of course, remained largely unaware of these behind-the-scenes calculations. To them, Sarah Ferguson was a comforting presence, a personality who could elicit both laughter and empathy. Parents watching with children appreciated her book promotions and educational insights. Daytime viewers enjoyed her candid commentary and warmth. Media coverage frequently praised her for her authenticity, her dedication to causes, and her resilience in the face of personal adversity. She became more than a former duchess. She became an accessible, admired figure whose story resonated far beyond the palace gates. And that resonance is exactly what made her removal from ITV so jarring when it occurred. The apex of this love affair between Sarah Ferguson and ITV was marked by high visibility and widespread acclaim. Specials centered on her life experiences, charitable endeavors, and literary projects were met with enthusiasm. Ratings consistently reflected her star power, demonstrating that audiences were invested not just in programming, but in her presence. Her ability to connect, to humanize her experiences while remaining aspirational, created a unique space within British television. ITV, which had always sought to balance entertainment with authenticity, had found in Sarah Ferguson a personality who embodied both. For a time, it seemed as though the relationship was unshakable, mutually beneficial, and destined to endure. Yet, as is often the case in stories of ascent, underlying currents of risk and vulnerability persisted. The very traits that made her captivating, openness, relatability, candor, also made her susceptible to scrutiny. Past connections, financial controversies, and lingering associations with Prince Andrew created latent risks that the network had long monitored. While these factors had not previously derailed her appearances, renewed attention to her former husband's controversies created a situation that ITV could no longer ignore. Suddenly, the love affair was imperiled, not by her performance or audience reception, but by forces external to the studio, beyond ratings and beyond control. The balance that had allowed her to thrive was now threatened, and the network's response would be swift and decisive. What made this transition particularly dramatic was the abruptness. One day, Sarah Ferguson was a centerpiece of daytime television, a figure whose presence could energize programming and attract viewers across the UK. The next, she was being quietly removed, her future on the network uncertain. Reports suggest that the decision was made internally, with little prior notice, and communicated to her through formal channels rather than personal conversation. For someone whose career had been built on charm, relationships, and personal connection, this approach reportedly felt cold, calculated, and deeply disorienting. The network, in protecting itself, had inadvertently created a rupture that would resonate not just in ratings, but in public perception. And the repercussions extended far beyond the studio. Media outlets, always eager for drama, quickly picked up the story, speculating about the reasons behind her removal. Questions arose about her associations, about renewed scrutiny surrounding her ex-husband, and about potential risk to the network's brand. Charities and partners began reassessing their affiliations, publishers evaluated pending projects, and public speculation grew. For Sarah Ferguson, the love affair that had elevated her visibility, credibility, and career trajectory had abruptly turned into a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly favor can shift in the world of media. Yet, even amid this upheaval, there is a paradoxical element to her story. The qualities that made Sarah Ferguson so compelling, her charisma, her relatability, her ability to navigate complex personal and public narratives, remain intact. They have not disappeared with her departure from ITV. And while the network may have severed formal ties, the public's fascination with her story, her personality, and her resilience endures. It is this enduring connection that provides both hope and tension, a reminder that careers can be disrupted, but narratives are rarely entirely erased. The love affair between Sarah Ferguson and ITV may have ended, but her story is far from finished, and the next chapter promises revelations, drama, and emotional turbulence that few could anticipate. As we move into the next chapter of this saga, it becomes clear that what seemed like a straightforward professional partnership was, in fact, a complex interplay of personality, public perception, and latent risk. ITV and Sarah Ferguson existed in a delicate balance, one where charm and charisma met corporate strategy and risk management. And when that balance tipped, it did so not quietly, but with repercussions that would ripple through her career, her relationships, and her very public persona. The question that now looms is simple yet profound. What happens when the partnership that once defined her resurgence ends abruptly? And who stands to gain, who stands to lose, and what secrets will emerge in the fallout? It happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning, or at least it seemed ordinary at first. Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, was preparing for what she assumed would be another routine day of meetings, interviews, and book promotions. She had navigated the public eye before, survived tabloid scrutiny, and rebuilt her career in the years after her divorce from Prince Andrew. But nothing could have prepared her for the call that would shatter her carefully reconstructed world in a matter of minutes. The call wasn't loud, dramatic, or accompanied by the flash of cameras. It was quiet, bureaucratic, almost antiseptic. But its implications were devastating. Imagine it. Your phone rings, and on the other end is the network that has supported you, championed your return to public life, and built programming around your presence. You expect routine check-ins, polite scheduling updates, or even constructive feedback. Instead, the words you hear are precise, professional, and shocking. We've decided to discontinue your appearances. Effective immediately. No preamble. No discussion. Just a statement of fact that alters the trajectory of your career in an instant. For Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess known for her warmth and quick wit, it felt like a betrayal, a cold, calculated severing of ties that had once seemed unbreakable. The reaction was immediate, intense, and deeply human. Sources close to her describe a moment of disbelief followed by emotional turbulence, a mix of panic, confusion, and a sense of vulnerability that few had seen in public. Sarah, who had thrived on connection and communication, suddenly found herself cut off, stripped of the very platform that had allowed her to redefine herself. It was as if the rug had been pulled out from under her, leaving her teetering in a world where visibility and relevance were the currency she had carefully cultivated. The abruptness of the decision, combined with the gravity of the implications, created a storm that no amount of charisma could immediately weather. But why had this happened? Sarah's appearances on ITV had been consistently successful. Ratings were strong. Public response was positive. Charitable initiatives and book promotions were ongoing. There was no performance issue, no scandal directly tied to her own actions, at least, not at the level that could justify such a drastic move. The explanation, as insiders later revealed, was more complex. It was about association, timing, and risk. Renewed scrutiny of her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, and his ties to the Epstein scandal had cast a shadow over her own public image, one that ITV executives deemed too risky to overlook. It was guilt by association, magnified by a network's need to protect its brand in an age of relentless media exposure. The phone call was, in many ways, a professional blunt force. But for Sarah, it was deeply personal. She had invested years in rebuilding her reputation, crafting a narrative that emphasized resilience, relatability, and creativity. She had worked tirelessly to prove that she was more than her royal past, more than the mistakes of her history, and more than the shadow cast by her ex-husband's controversies. And yet, in a matter of minutes, all of that work was overshadowed by external forces, by reputational risk, and by the network's need to preempt potential backlash. The suddenness of the decision left her scrambling, forced to grapple with the reality that even a meticulously managed comeback could unravel without warning. Following the call, her immediate actions were frantic yet measured. Reports suggest that she contacted her PR advisors, legal representatives, and close confidants almost simultaneously. She sought clarity, attempting to understand whether the decision was final, whether there was room for negotiation, or whether the network would consider a phased exit rather than an abrupt cut. But the response, though professional, was firm. The decision was final. ITV was no longer interested in featuring her in their programming, regardless of ratings or audience loyalty. For someone whose career and public identity were deeply intertwined with visibility, the impact was profound. As the shock settled, Sarah reportedly began to consider the broader implications. Beyond the immediate loss of television appearances, there were cascading consequences. Book deals and charitable affiliations that had been facilitated by her media presence now appeared precarious. Opportunities that had once seemed secure were suddenly uncertain. The network's decision sent a signal, not just to Sarah Ferguson, but to all associated partners, collaborators, and sponsors, that her presence was now considered a liability rather than an asset. It was a moment of reckoning, a turning point where visibility collided with vulnerability in the harshest possible way. And yet, the drama extended far beyond the professional realm. Sources suggest that Sarah also felt a personal betrayal. ITV executives, with whom she had cultivated professional relationships and mutual trust, had made a decision without her knowledge or input. The lack of personal communication, the absence of empathy in conveying such a life-altering decision, deepened the emotional impact. For someone who had spent decades navigating public perception and managing personal relationships under intense scrutiny, this felt like a rupture that went beyond business. It was a fracture in a support system she had relied upon to help rebuild her life after the upheaval of her divorce. The call itself became emblematic of a larger, more troubling narrative: the fragility of celebrity, the precarity of reputation, and the speed with which public favor can shift. Sarah Ferguson had survived scandal before, yes. She had endured tabloid scrutiny, financial difficulties, and the enduring public fascination with her royal life. She had reinvented herself through writing, media appearances, and charitable work. But this call was different. It was a professional and public severing of ties, a moment that underscored just how vulnerable even the most celebrated figures can be when associations, timing, and media scrutiny converge. From a strategic standpoint, ITV's decision reflected broader trends in the media landscape. Networks, always sensitive to public perception and advertiser concerns, operate with an acute awareness of risk. Even a hint of controversy can threaten revenue, viewership, and brand integrity. In Sarah's case, renewed attention to Prince Andrew's controversies, combined with the persistent shadow of the Epstein scandal, created a perfect storm of risk assessment. The network's calculus was clear: the benefits of featuring Sarah Ferguson no longer outweighed the potential fallout. It was a decision driven by caution, reputation management, and a desire to protect the network from scrutiny that could ripple far beyond daytime television. Yet the public did not fully grasp these complexities. Audiences, accustomed to seeing Sarah as a vibrant, relatable figure on screen, were shocked when news of her axing surfaced. Social media erupted with speculation, sympathy, and outrage. Many questioned the fairness of punishing someone for associations beyond her control. Others debated whether ITV had made the right choice in prioritizing brand safety over loyalty to a personality who had been instrumental in their ratings' success. The debate highlighted a fundamental tension in modern media: the delicate balance between audience engagement, risk management, and the human cost of corporate decision-making. For Sarah Ferguson herself, the aftermath of the call was a whirlwind. She reportedly spent hours reviewing her options, weighing the impact on her career, her charitable work, and her personal brand. She consulted legal advisors, media strategists, and trusted friends, attempting to formulate a response that would protect her interests while preserving her dignity. The emotional toll was significant. Sources describe her as terrified, confused, and deeply hurt, struggling to comprehend how quickly her world had shifted. The call, brief and clinical as it was, had unleashed a cascade of consequences that would redefine her professional and personal landscape. And yet, even in the midst of this upheaval, Sarah Ferguson's resilience remained evident. She understood that public perception, while powerful, could also be shaped and managed. She began to consider strategic responses, public statements, and potential avenues for reclaiming visibility. But every move had to be calculated, every statement scrutinized, because in a world where past associations carry immense weight, even a minor misstep could exacerbate the situation. It was a delicate dance, one that required emotional fortitude, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate a media landscape that had suddenly become perilous. But what made this call truly transformative was not just the professional loss. It was the realization that her past, once thought manageable, could resurface in ways that directly impacted her present. The intersection of personal history, public perception, and media scrutiny created a situation in which the consequences of association were immediate and unavoidable. The very networks, charities, and partners that had once celebrated her were now assessing their ties with a new lens of caution. The call, brief and seemingly procedural, had initiated a ripple effect with ramifications extending far beyond ITV's daytime schedule. As the hours and days following the call unfolded, Sarah Ferguson began to confront the reality of her situation. She was no longer just a media personality or a former royal. She was a figure navigating the precarious intersection of fame, scrutiny, and association. Every decision, every appearance, every interaction now carried heightened significance. The call had not merely ended a professional relationship. It had signaled a shift in her world, a moment when survival would require creativity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to her own narrative. A resurfaced payment, a resurfaced secret, and suddenly, everything changed. That's how insiders described the moment ITV executives realized that Sarah Ferguson's carefully managed comeback could no longer be treated as risk-free. For years, the story of her association with her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, had lingered in the background, acknowledged, but largely overlooked. Tabloids had occasionally raised eyebrows, financial reports had hinted at irregularities, and media commentators had speculated about minor controversies. None of it had ever reached a point where ITV felt compelled to act. But the emergence of a resurfaced payment, linked to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, was a game-changer, a detail that suddenly cast Sarah Ferguson in a light the network could no longer ignore. The payment itself was relatively small in the grand scheme of wealth and scandal, reportedly £15,000, a sum meant to assist Sarah with personal financial obligations. It had been discreetly handled years earlier and had faded from public memory. But as the Epstein network and Prince Andrew's entanglements resurfaced in court filings and media investigations, the payment took on a new significance. To ITV executives, what had once been a minor footnote now represented a tangible connection to a global scandal, a potential liability that could not be overlooked. Risk assessment meetings turned into urgent consultations with legal teams, public relations specialists, and senior decision-makers. Every angle was scrutinized, every potential outcome evaluated. For Sarah Ferguson, the payment had been a practical step during a difficult period, nothing more. It had not involved wrongdoing, nor had it implicated her directly in any criminal activity. Yet in the court of public perception, context is often irrelevant. The media thrives on association, insinuation, and sensationalism. What had once been a discreet financial arrangement became, in the eyes of the network, a glaring vulnerability. The resurfacing of this detail, coinciding with renewed scrutiny of Prince Andrew, created a scenario where ITV could no longer separate Sarah Ferguson from the broader scandal. The calculus was simple. The risk of continued appearances outweighed the benefit of ratings, charm, or nostalgia. Inside the network, fear morphed into action. Executives debated how to address the situation without drawing unnecessary attention, how to distance themselves while minimizing public speculation. The idea of quietly terminating her appearances, of framing it as routine scheduling changes, became increasingly attractive. Legal teams reviewed every public statement she had made, every media appearance, every book promotion. Could anything she said or did reignite headlines that would link ITV to past controversies? Every email, every promotional blurb, every mention of her name became a potential trigger. The network's response, though invisible to the public, was meticulous, calculated, and driven by the need to mitigate risk in an environment where perception often outweighed reality. For Sarah Ferguson, however, the implications were not just professional, they were deeply personal. She had spent years rebuilding her public image, carefully crafting a persona that emphasized resilience, warmth, and relatability. Her work as an author, her television appearances, and her charitable engagements were all part of a narrative designed to separate her identity from past controversies. And yet, despite her efforts, a single payment, a minor detail long forgotten, was suddenly magnified into a symbol of association, a reason for her abrupt removal from ITV's programming. The emotional toll, sources suggest, was profound. A mix of frustration, disbelief, and fear about how her carefully reconstructed life could unravel so quickly. The network's concern extended beyond ratings or public perception. Advertisers, who fund programming and influence decisions at the highest levels, were reportedly briefed on potential fallout. Even a minor connection to controversy could result in advertiser withdrawal, negative publicity, or social media backlash. ITV executives knew that in the digital age, news travels fast, speculation spreads faster, and public outrage can amplify at unprecedented speed. The resurfaced payment, trivial in financial terms but potent in perception, became the catalyst for decisive action. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson's personal and professional support network began to feel the strain. Charities, collaborators, and publishers, previously enthusiastic about her involvement, reportedly started to distance themselves, wary of reputational risk. Deals were paused or reconsidered, public appearances were delayed, and promotional campaigns were quietly shelved. The reverberations of this resurfaced payment were felt far beyond ITV's boardrooms, touching every facet of her post-royal career. It was a stark reminder that in the world of public perception, even minor associations can have outsized consequences, particularly when magnified by scandal. What made this revelation even more alarming was the timing. The resurfacing of the payment coincided with a resurgence of media interest in Prince Andrew's activities, ongoing legal investigations, and a renewed focus on the Epstein scandal. For ITV, the timing created a perfect storm. A beloved television personality with a charming public image, linked indirectly to a global controversy, at a moment when scrutiny was at its highest. The network's risk assessment left little room for error, and the decision to remove Sarah Ferguson from programming was accelerated by the convergence of these factors. Inside ITV, the atmosphere grew tense as the implications became clear. Meetings were convened to determine not just how to remove Sarah from programming, but how to manage the narrative afterward. Legal advisors evaluated potential media responses, PR teams drafted contingency statements, and executives considered the broader impact on audience trust. Every step was calculated, every word scrutinized, every action weighed against the potential fallout. The network was acting in a landscape where a single misstep could reverberate across social media, press coverage, and public opinion. A landscape where perception often outweighed fact, and where a minor detail could become a headline of international significance. For Sarah Ferguson, the professional shock merged with personal anxiety. She reportedly reached out to trusted advisors, seeking guidance and reassurance, but the certainty of ITV's decision left little room for negotiation. The payment, once a minor financial footnote, had become a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that the past cannot always be separated from the present. Her emotional response was one of fear, frustration, and incredulity. How could a single detail, so seemingly insignificant at the time, now jeopardize her hard-won comeback? And yet, the situation was also a test of resilience. Sarah Ferguson had weathered public scrutiny before, navigated tabloid attacks, and reinvented herself multiple times. She understood that in the world of fame and media, perception is often as important as reality, and that maintaining control over one's narrative is both a challenge and a necessity. But even someone as experienced and strategic as Fergie could not have anticipated the magnitude of the impact that a resurfaced payment would have when amplified by a network's fear, ongoing scandals, and media speculation. The resurfaced payment also served as a harbinger of broader revelations to come. Insiders suggest that once this detail surfaced, other connections, communications, and documents began to be reviewed with heightened scrutiny. What had previously been a manageable narrative was suddenly under the microscope. Every association, every professional link, every past decision was evaluated for potential exposure. The payment, seemingly trivial in isolation, became the thread that could unravel a complex tapestry of personal, professional, and public relationships. And so, as Sarah Ferguson grappled with the reality of her removal from ITV, it became clear that this was more than a single decision. It was the intersection of timing, association, and risk. It was a reminder that in the world of public life, past connections can resurface with consequences that are both immediate and far-reaching. And it was a warning that even the most meticulously managed comeback can be vulnerable to forces beyond one's control. But just as the network moved to contain the immediate risk, other pressures were quietly mounting. Media outlets, ever alert for stories with sensational appeal, were beginning to pick up whispers of the resurfaced payment and the network's abrupt action. Charities and collaborators were reassessing their affiliations. Social media speculation was starting to spread, amplifying the sense of crisis. For Sarah Ferguson, What had started as a single shocking phone call was now evolving into a multi-front challenge, one that would test her resilience, strategy, and emotional fortitude like never before. One leaked image can destroy decades of reputation. The phrase echoed quietly through ITV's executive offices, whispered in tones of disbelief and alarm. It wasn't a scandal they had created. It wasn't a story they wanted. Yet there it was, a photograph, resurfacing after years in obscurity, threatening to unravel the careful narrative Sarah Ferguson had spent decades constructing. The image itself was innocuous at first glance, seemingly ordinary, yet the implications were explosive. It linked her, albeit indirectly, to events and people connected to a network of scandal that had already claimed countless headlines and reputations. Sarah Ferguson had long understood the power of images. Every public appearance, every photograph, every televised smile was carefully considered to maintain her persona. Relatable, yet aspirational. Charming, yet grounded. Photographs could elevate, humanize, and endear her to the public, but they could also betray, misrepresent, and complicate. She had seen it before. Tabloids twisting moments of candid laughter into caricatures, photographs framed to imply impropriety, media narratives crafted around a single glance or gesture. But nothing prepared her for the wave that this particular file would generate. The photograph in question reportedly emerged from an archive associated with her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, and his entanglement with Jeffrey Epstein. The image itself was not criminal, not incriminating in a legal sense, yet its context was devastating. It suggested proximity, association, and awareness of events that the public was only beginning to reassess in light of renewed investigations. The optics were enough. A former royal, a public personality, connected by a single frame to a scandal that had dominated headlines for over a decade. For ITV, the calculation was simple but brutal. Risk that had previously been manageable was now magnified exponentially by the resurfacing of this image. Executives reportedly convened emergency meetings to assess the potential fallout. Legal teams analyzed the context, PR specialists considered the narrative, and program directors evaluated the implications for ongoing and future segments. Every possible question was debated. Could this photograph trigger negative media coverage? Would advertisers pull support? Could audiences interpret this as endorsement or complicity? The fear was palpable, and every decision carried immense weight. To the network, the stakes were not merely ratings. They were survival, credibility, and brand integrity. For Sarah Ferguson, the emergence of this photograph was both shocking and deeply personal. She had spent years cultivating a post-royal identity that emphasized resilience, relatability, and positive contribution. Her work as an author, charitable engagements, and television appearances were all carefully aligned to reinforce this image. And yet, one photograph, one single frame captured, contextualized, and interpreted, threatened to undermine everything. The emotional impact, sources suggest, was intense. Frustration, disbelief, and fear intertwined with a sense of vulnerability that few had seen publicly. The photograph also highlighted a central truth about modern media. Context is rarely considered, nuance is often lost, and public perception can be as powerful as legal fact. Audiences rarely distinguish between direct involvement and mere proximity. The media thrives on insinuation, on linking personalities to events that are tangentially related, and on creating narratives that attract attention and engagement. For someone in Sarah Ferguson's position, visibility is both a blessing and a curse. Every smile, every gesture, every past appearance can be repurposed, reframed, and amplified in ways that serve a story, regardless of its fairness or accuracy. Reports suggest that ITV's reaction was immediate and decisive. Decisions that might have been gradual, measured, or collaborative were accelerated. The network moved to terminate her appearances, shelve upcoming segments, and halt promotions associated with her brand. Contingency plans were activated to mitigate potential backlash, including preparing statements, briefing media teams, and evaluating every upcoming show for potential risks. The photograph, while a singular event, catalyzed a cascade of actions that would fundamentally alter Sarah Ferguson's professional landscape. What made the situation particularly intense was the interplay between past and present. Sarah had faced scrutiny before. She had weathered tabloid attacks, financial challenges, and public criticism over her life choices. She had rebuilt her career, earning acclaim as an author and a beloved media personality. But the resurfacing photograph was a stark reminder that the past, no matter how carefully managed, can resurface with consequences that are immediate, visible, and emotionally taxing. It underscored the fragility of public favor and the precarity of a career built in the glare of constant attention. The photograph also triggered internal anxieties within ITV. Staff members responsible for communications, programming, and public relations reportedly began self-censoring, avoiding casual mentions of Sarah and second-guessing routine decisions. The network became hyper-aware of perception, cautious in messaging, and vigilant in monitoring media coverage. Fear became systemic, affecting every layer of decision-making. What had once been routine interactions were now filtered through layers of concern. Would this email be leaked? Could this segment reignite headlines? Was every public statement being interpreted correctly? The photograph, small in size but massive in consequence, had transformed the internal culture of the network. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson's personal strategy shifted. She reportedly engaged in careful media management, consulting with legal advisors, PR experts, and trusted confidants. Every potential public statement was considered, every interview evaluated for risk, every appearance scrutinized for potential misinterpretation. It was a delicate balancing act. How to defend one's reputation without drawing further attention to a photograph whose mere existence had already created a crisis. The emotional strain, insiders suggest, was considerable. Sources describe moments of private frustration, tears, and late-night calls seeking reassurance and clarity. The ripple effect extended beyond ITV. Charities, collaborators, and partners began reassessing their involvement with Sarah Ferguson. Publishers delayed book releases, promotional campaigns were quietly altered, and social media discussions intensified. The photograph had created a signal to external stakeholders that association with her carried risk. While no legal wrongdoing was implied, the perception of potential controversy was sufficient to disrupt her carefully constructed ecosystem. The consequences were real, immediate, and emotionally destabilizing. And yet, there was an undercurrent of irony in the situation. The very charisma, warmth, and relatability that had made Sarah Ferguson such a powerful presence on ITV and beloved by audiences was now being scrutinized as part of the risk calculation. Her visibility, the source of her success, had become the vector through which fear, risk, and professional peril spread. What had once been a love affair between a network and a personality had transformed into a case study in the fragility of reputation, perception, and professional security. The photograph, however, was only the first of many challenges. Once it surfaced, other documents, communications, and minor details began to be evaluated under a microscope. Every connection, every appearance, every professional or personal interaction from the past was reviewed for potential exposure. The photograph became a symbolic catalyst, initiating a chain of events that would force Sarah Ferguson to confront vulnerabilities she had long managed and to navigate a storm she could not have anticipated. As the story unfolded, it became clear that the impact of the photograph extended far beyond immediate professional setbacks. It challenged Sarah's sense of control over her narrative, her personal confidence, and her ability to protect the reputation she had painstakingly rebuilt. It was a stark reminder that in the modern media landscape, perception often outweighs reality, and that a single image, resurfaced, reframed, and reinterpreted, can create consequences that are both swift and far-reaching. And just as the network began to stabilize its internal response, whispers emerged that the photograph was only one piece of a larger puzzle. Leaks, documents, and correspondence suggested additional associations and connections, amplifying the sense of crisis and intensifying both internal and external scrutiny. Sarah Ferguson, who had once felt confident in her ability to navigate public perception, now faced an environment where every move could have amplified consequences. Her world, built on charisma, resilience, and public trust, was suddenly precarious. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a gathering of anxiety, calculation, and whispered dread. Behind the polished glass doors of ITV headquarters, The atmosphere was far removed from the sunny, bustling image broadcast to the public. Executives, legal advisors, and senior producers sat around a table, papers shuffled nervously, phones buzzing silently. The air was thick with tension. The name Sarah Ferguson had once brought excitement, ratings, and charm to the network. Now, it invoked fear. Fear of headlines, of leaks, of a scandal that could spiral beyond anyone's control. And the network's decision to remove her from programming wasn't a simple scheduling change. It was a strategic operation conducted with surgical precision. The meetings reportedly began quietly, with senior executives outlining the problem in stark terms. Ratings were strong, yes. Audience engagement was high. Sarah Ferguson's appearances had become a cornerstone of daytime programming. But the resurfaced photograph, the renewed scrutiny of Prince Andrew, and the lingering associations with Jeffrey Epstein had changed the risk calculus entirely. Every element of her public persona that had once been celebrated, her warmth, her relatability, her charm, was now weighed against the potential for reputational damage. Every smile, every interview, every past appearance was examined under the harsh light of possibility. Insiders described the discussion as meticulous and exhaustive. Legal advisors presented the potential scenarios, media inquiries, public backlash, advertiser withdrawals, and even social media outrage. Each risk was analyzed, each probability assessed, and each mitigation strategy debated. The room was silent at times, punctuated only by the tapping of keyboards, the scribble of notes, or the low hum of concern. Everyone in that room understood that one wrong move could amplify the issue exponentially. The stakes weren't just ratings. They were credibility, brand integrity, and the network's standing in a media ecosystem that thrives on sensationalism. The tension was not limited to the executives at the top. Producers, program directors, and communications staff were acutely aware that their work would be impacted. Every segment featuring Sarah Ferguson was scrutinized. Scripts were reviewed, footage analyzed, and promotional materials reevaluated. Decisions that might have once been routine, like scheduling interviews or posting social media content, were suddenly subject to multiple layers of approval. Even casual references to Sarah in internal communications were filtered, carefully worded, and logged. Fear had become systemic, infiltrating every level of the organization. What made these meetings particularly intense was the dual nature of Sarah Ferguson's presence on ITV. She was, on one hand, a ratings powerhouse, capable of elevating programming and drawing in a loyal audience. On the other, she was a potential liability, a connection to a scandal with global attention and serious legal implications. Balancing these two realities required a level of precision rarely demanded in day-to-day television operations. Every decision had to weigh audience engagement against the risk of public scrutiny. Every action had to consider not just immediate consequences, but long-term repercussions. According to insiders, the network's strategy evolved in real time. Initial discussions focused on damage control, limiting Sarah's on-screen appearances, reviewing contractual obligations, and preparing for potential inquiries from the press or advertisers. Legal teams scrutinized her past statements, interviews, and written work, seeking any material that could be misinterpreted or used against the network. PR specialists drafted contingencies for every conceivable scenario, from subtle online commentary to full-blown media exposés. The atmosphere was tense, with every participant aware that the wrong step could exacerbate an already volatile situation. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson herself remained largely in the dark. The decision to terminate her appearances was communicated formally, but the depth of fear, scrutiny, and strategic calculation behind it was invisible to her. To her, it felt abrupt and disorienting. She had spent years cultivating her public image, building trust with audiences, and navigating her post-royal career with care. Yet behind closed doors at ITV, her presence had transformed from an asset to a liability, a perception that would soon have cascading consequences. The fear inside ITV also had ripple effects beyond immediate programming decisions. Charities, collaborators, and publishing partners became more cautious. Organizations that had relied on Sarah Ferguson's visibility began reevaluating their associations. Publishers paused or delayed book releases, promotional campaigns were shelved, and potential sponsorships were reconsidered. The internal anxiety at ITV signaled to the broader ecosystem that her presence was no longer unambiguously safe. The network's caution had become a warning, reshaping the behavior of everyone connected to her public persona. During these meetings, executives reportedly debated not just the timing of the announcement, but also how to frame it publicly. Could they present it as a routine scheduling change? Should they issue a brief statement about programming adjustments? Or would acknowledging the context of her associations create more problems than it solved? Each option carried risks. Too much transparency could invite media scrutiny, while silence could fuel speculation and conspiracy. The fear of misinterpretation dictated every word, every planned response, and every interaction. Even in private, the network's concern was palpable. Staff members described a culture of caution unprecedented in recent memory. Casual conversations were monitored, emails filtered, and discussions about Sarah Ferguson were limited to closed-door meetings. Creativity and spontaneity, hallmarks of daytime television, were subordinated to risk mitigation. Every decision was scrutinized, every phrase weighed for potential consequences. The network had become hypervigilant, a direct reflection of the fear that Sarah Ferguson's name now invoked. And yet, amidst this atmosphere of tension and scrutiny, there was also a recognition of Sarah Ferguson's enduring appeal. Executives acknowledged that the decision to remove her from programming would likely provoke audience reaction, that some viewers would be disappointed, and that social media would amplify the story. Ratings were not irrelevant, nor was public sentiment. But in the calculations made behind closed doors, reputation outweighed popularity. The network had concluded that the potential fallout of continued association, however indirect, was too great to risk. In the weeks following the decision, internal operations at ITV reportedly became even more cautious. Every aspect of programming involving Sarah Ferguson's past appearances was reviewed. Footage was assessed for context, social media content reconsidered, and press materials revised. Contingency plans were implemented to address potential leaks or unexpected media inquiries. The fear inside ITV had transformed into a structured, procedural response, but the emotional weight of those decisions remained. Executives were acutely aware that their actions would have consequences for the network, for advertisers, and for the public perception of both the organization and the individual at the center of the storm. And while the network moved to contain and manage the fallout, the impact on Sarah Ferguson herself continued to grow. Being abruptly removed from a platform she had helped elevate, with little explanation beyond formal communication, sent ripples through her professional and personal life. Opportunities she had relied on, from media appearances to charitable engagements, were now uncertain. Public perception was fragile, and every move she made would be scrutinized in the context of the network's decision. The fear inside ITV had now extended outward, shaping the environment in which she operated and amplifying the challenges she faced. Ultimately, the meetings behind closed doors at ITV were a microcosm of the larger drama unfolding. They demonstrated how fear, risk assessment, and reputational concerns can drive decisions that profoundly affect individual careers, even for someone as celebrated and beloved as Sarah Ferguson. The calculated removal of her appearances reflected a network operating under pressure, balancing competing priorities, and confronting the reality that association with scandal, regardless of intent, can have immediate and far-reaching consequences. But even as the network stabilized its internal response and implemented strategies to manage the fallout, one critical element remained unresolved. What would Sarah Ferguson do next? How would she respond to being abruptly removed from a platform that had defined her post-royal career? The decisions made behind closed doors at ITV had set in motion a series of challenges, revelations, and confrontations that would test her resilience, ingenuity, and emotional fortitude in ways she had never experienced before. The phone stopped ringing. That simple phrase, whispered by sources close to Sarah Ferguson, captured a reality more devastating than any tabloid headline. Friends, collaborators, and allies who had once celebrated her resilience, laughed with her, and shared in her post-royal reinvention were now conspicuously absent. For Sarah, the abrupt silence was not just professional, it was deeply personal. The love and support she had relied upon for years, the network of people who had cheered her comebacks and championed her projects, were suddenly muted, hesitant, or gone altogether. And the reason was clear: fear. Fear of association, fear of scandal, fear of being connected to someone whose name now appeared in a renewed spotlight due to Prince Andrew's controversies and resurfaced ties to Jeffrey Epstein. What had been minor whispers in the background of Sarah's career suddenly became defining factors in the decisions of those around her. Charities that had once welcomed her involvement quietly distanced themselves. Publishers and literary collaborators paused contracts or reconsidered book deals. Even friends who had publicly supported her began to speak less, their interactions filtered by caution rather than loyalty. The human cost of public scrutiny and corporate caution had become painfully evident. It wasn't immediate betrayal, not in the sense of malice, but the effect was the same. For someone who had spent years rebuilding her life and career, the sense of isolation was profound. Sarah Ferguson, the woman who had captured public attention with charm, humor, and relatability, suddenly found herself navigating a landscape where every handshake, email, or phone call carried risk. Trust, which had once been abundant, became scarce. Allies became cautious observers, offering measured support rather than enthusiastic encouragement. The world she had known, built painstakingly over decades, was shifting beneath her feet. The emotional toll, sources suggest, was immense. Sarah, who had faced the glare of public scrutiny many times before, experienced a renewed vulnerability. The abrupt withdrawal of support was not a single event, but a cascade of small, piercing losses. A missed phone call from a longtime collaborator, a charity declining her participation in a fundraiser, a publishing house delaying promotional work. Each instance compounded the sense of isolation, amplifying anxiety and fear about the trajectory of her career and public image. The silence was deafening, and the realization that even those closest to her were now calculating risk rather than offering loyalty was devastating. The situation also exposed the fragility of networks built on public perception. Relationships that had been reliable, strong, and mutually supportive were suddenly contingent upon external factors: media scrutiny, corporate caution, and the potential for association with scandal. People who had once celebrated Sarah Ferguson's charisma and resilience now reevaluated their affiliations, not out of personal animosity, but because their own professional and public reputations were at stake. It was a stark reminder that in the world of public figures, friendship and support are often fragile commodities, vulnerable to the tides of perception and circumstance. One particularly painful element of this shift was the reaction of charities that had previously relied on Sarah's involvement to raise awareness and funds. For years, she had dedicated herself to causes she cared about, leveraging her platform to bring attention to children's welfare, educational programs, and health initiatives. These were not performative gestures. They were deeply personal commitments that reflected her values. Yet as the scrutiny surrounding her name intensified, charities, fearing negative media attention and potential donor backlash, quietly withdrew invitations and support. The abruptness of their distancing, even if understandable from a risk management perspective, left Sarah with the feeling of abandonment. Similarly, the literary world, which had embraced Sarah Ferguson as a respected children's author, began to reassess their partnerships. Publishing houses, aware of the potential reputational risk in associating with someone whose name had resurfaced in headlines connected to scandal, paused book releases and delayed promotional campaigns. Collaborators who had once praised her creativity and dedication now issued carefully measured statements or remained silent. Each pause, each delay, each cautious interaction added to the sense that Sarah Ferguson, once a celebrated figure in media and literary circles, was now navigating a world where trust was conditional and support was transactional. Even friends in her personal life reportedly altered their behavior. Calls became less frequent, invitations were postponed, and social media interactions diminished. While many of these actions were motivated by concern for their own exposure rather than ill will, the cumulative effect was isolation. Sarah, known for her ability to connect, to inspire, and to charm, found herself grappling with an emotional landscape that felt foreign and cold. The very networks she had relied upon to rebuild her life after the palace were now filtered through caution, fear, and self-preservation. What makes this moment particularly poignant is the contrast with her previous experiences. Sarah Ferguson had always been resilient, facing criticism, scandal, and public scrutiny with a mixture of candor and composure. She had survived tabloid sensationalism, financial challenges, and the complexities of post-royal life. Yet the withdrawal of support by friends and collaborators introduced a new layer of emotional complexity. A realization that isolation could come not just from the public or the press, but from those whom she had trusted and counted on. The betrayal was not necessarily malicious, but it was deeply felt, a reminder that the consequences of public scrutiny extend beyond headlines to the very core of personal and professional relationships. Insiders suggest that this erosion of support was gradual, a series of subtle withdrawals rather than overt confrontations. Invitations to events were quietly rescinded. Emails went unanswered. Partnerships that had seemed solid were reconsidered in hushed tones. To the outside observer, these actions may have appeared insignificant or routine. To Sarah Ferguson, however, they represented a profound shift in the landscape she had relied upon. The cumulative effect was a sense of vulnerability and uncertainty that intensified the emotional weight of her professional challenges. Adding to the complexity was the public's perception. While many fans continued to admire Sarah Ferguson for her resilience, relatability, and charm, others interpreted the withdrawal of support as confirmation of ongoing controversy. Media coverage, fueled by the resurfaced photograph and the renewed scrutiny of Prince Andrew, amplified the narrative of risk and association. Social media speculation, public commentary, and even celebrity gossip contributed to the sense that Sarah Ferguson was navigating a world increasingly defined by caution, fear, and suspicion. Every interaction, every appearance, every word was now filtered through the lens of potential consequence. And yet, amidst this isolation, there were glimmers of resilience. Sarah Ferguson reportedly continued her work, engaging with charitable initiatives where possible, pursuing literary projects, and maintaining a presence in the public eye, however cautious. She began to assess her next steps strategically, understanding that in the world of media and public perception, visibility is both a tool and a shield. The loss of support, while painful, became a catalyst for reevaluation. Which relationships could be rebuilt? Which partnerships were essential? And how could she navigate the storm without losing sight of her personal and professional goals? This chapter of Sarah Ferguson's story also underscores a broader truth about the nature of fame, media scrutiny, and public perception. Relationships that appear steadfast can be fragile, alliances contingent, and support conditional. In the high-stakes environment of public life, loyalty is often tested by external pressures, and even the strongest connections can fracture when reputation, risk, and perception collide. For Sarah Ferguson, the sudden shift in her support network highlighted the precariousness of celebrity, the fragility of trust, and the emotional challenges of navigating a world where both professional and personal relationships are constantly scrutinized. As the weeks passed, the impact of friends turning into cautious observers became increasingly tangible. Every decision, every public engagement, every opportunity for collaboration carried the weight of potential risk. Sarah Ferguson, once celebrated for her charm and resilience, now faced a landscape where isolation, suspicion, and strategic calculation defined interactions. The withdrawal of support not only affected her professional